Hi, listeners, and welcome to another Solarpunk Presents Bonus Chat. I'm Ariel.
And I'm Christina. In today's bonus chat, we want to talk about using hydrogen as a fuel. What is it? How do we produce it? And how do we get energy out of it?
And whether or not so-called green hydrogen really is green.
And we don't mean the color.
And whether or not this green hydrogen has a role to play in getting us towards net zero carbon emissions and keeping us there.
Before we start, here's a warning of a trigger warning that I've inserted at 9 minutes and 16 seconds because we briefly discuss a method that people used to use to kill themselves. If you don't want to hear that, you'll have to skip from 9 minutes and 16 seconds until the beginning of minute 11. Now here's our bonus episode. As anyone who has ever heard of the Hindenburg disaster knows, hydrogen gas is both lighter than air and highly flammable. And anything that's highly flammable is a storehouse of energy that could potentially be used as a fuel.
Well, in fact, back in the 1930s, there really were airships that floated across the Atlantic Ocean, bringing travelers back and forth between Germany and the east coast of the USA.
This was thanks to the airline Deutsche Zeppelin Reederei, which translates as the German Zeppelin Transport Company, which made nearly a dozen successful trips with their hydrogen-filled Zeppelins before the unfortunate incident on May 6, 1937. At 7:25 p.m., as the Zeppelin Hindenburg was landing in Lakehurst, New Jersey, there was most likely a gas leak, a hydrogen gas leak, that incited a static spark that caught the 7 million cubic feet of hydrogen gas holding the Zeppelin aloft on fire. It took less than a minute for all of that hydrogen to burn entirely away as the airship crashed the last few hundred feet to the ground. But by that point, everything else had caught fire, including the many tons of fuel oil for the engines, which burned for many hours more.
Holy crap. I kind of thought it had been a one and done affair, like exploded, crashed, and that was it.
Well, the hydrogen going up in smoke was over in a flash bang whoosh, but the whole disaster involved people jumping out of windows and trying to scramble away once they got to the ground, and people on the ground trying to rescue people from the burning wreckage and mangled steel. Incredibly, 35 of the 97 people on board the airship survived, although most of the survivors were horribly burned. In the end, though, it was World War II and passenger planes that really did in Zeppelins as air transport. Although the Deutsche Zeppelin Reederei has risen again to operate as a Zeppelin airline. It's been around for about 20 years.
Wait, there are still Zeppelins in this day and age? Like, I'd heard rumors a few years ago about some startups wanting to make it a thing again, but, and excuse the pun, I didn't think they'd got off the ground. I didn't know the original company was still operating, especially after the Hindenburg disaster.
The company was resurrected. I don't think it's been running continuously since the 1930s, but
Okay.
well, and there are plenty of blimps. You know, for as long as I can remember, there has always been a couple of blimps floating over the skies of Los Angeles, for instance, for reasons I never really grasped beyond, say, advertising. But they aren't and weren't filled with hydrogen, but with helium, which is not flammable. But anyway, it is tempting to think that the explosion of the Hindenburg was the fiery end of our first attempt to use hydrogen gas in transport, albeit in the case of Zeppelins, not as a fuel.
Which is more what we want to chat about today, the possibility of using hydrogen as fuel. And this is where I defer to Christina as the scientist who actually knows how these chemicals work.
Yeah, well, I mean, to some degree. And so, to be fair, I brought the Hindenburg up because it's the first thing a lot of people think about when you talk about using hydrogen as fuel. As in, isn't that explosive? But to start with some basics. By hydrogen, we're talking about hydrogen gas, or H2, which consists of two hydrogen atoms bonded together to form a molecule of H2. The exciting thing about this is that when you oxidize H2 with oxygen, our good old friend O2, you don't end up producing CO2 as a waste product, but water. In other words, when one molecule of O2 reacts with two molecules of H2, what you end up with is two molecules of H2O, plus energy, either in the form of electricity or heat, depending on what sort of apparatus the reaction is happening in.
Preferably not a passenger Zeppelin.
Okay, I meant either in a fuel cell or in a burner of some sort, like on a stove or in a combustion engine or in a gas-fired power plant. Those last options, in part, are what have gotten people thinking, oh, cool, we could just swap in H2 for natural gas, and to borrow a British phrase that I never understood the origin of, Bob's your uncle. You can vroom vroom around in a hydrogen fuel cell powered car. Oh, not really vroom vroom, probably because it'll be electric. And run your gas boiler, your gas stove, and your gas-fired power plant without producing CO2.
That sounds awesome, and also way too good to be true.
Yeah, indeed. It is indeed absolutely not that simple.
And I just have to interject here before we go any further to just register my disdain for the term natural gas. How embarrassingly greenwashy.
So I'm curious, do you guys also call it natural gas in Canada?
Well, there's a movement now, a very small grassroots movement to call it fossil gas, which really does need to get more popular, I think. But for the most part, we do call it natural gas in Canada, and we have for several decades now.
So the name natural gas isn't originally greenwashy. It actually dates back to the early 1800s, and it was called natural to distinguish it from coal gas. Natural gas is natural in that it isn't synthesized in a lab or a factory. And this stands in contrast to coal gas, which was made by heating coal to high temperatures in the absence of air and collecting the resulting gases.
That sounds toxic. And like the difference between the two different types of gases seems to me like it's basically a technicality. So it's not exactly a sound basis for touting any type of gas as green. But hey, I mean, slap the label natural on products, and it's a pretty good chance that people will think that it's good for you.
Yeah, well, these people have somehow never learned that bitter almonds are quite naturally full of cyanide, or that there are plenty of mushrooms that will quite happily, quite naturally kill you if you eat them. But natural gas and coal gas are not exactly the same thing. Coal gas has a lot more toxins in it. I'm with that. It's probably better to call it fossil gas, as it is known in some quarters. That is a better moniker, at least in terms of getting folks to associate it with global warming, instead of thinking of it as a good, clean, green thing. Right here in Europe, they're like gas-fired power plants. That's power pants. Here in Europe, they're like, yeah, let's call gas-fired power plants green energy because it's cleaner than coal. And you're like, no, it's not. It's not.
I
So
mean,
now,
like, do we still produce town gas or like coal gas? Like, is that still a thing?
it's
It's
not
very
so.
old-timey.
It is very old-timey. I think there are minor amounts that are produced every year for reasons I couldn't tell you. So it hasn't gone 100% extinct, but near enough. I
Okay,
certainly
because
have never run into it.
interesting. Because yeah, I didn't know that coal gas was like a thing that existed until you literally just told me. So I think that like, yeah, calling it natural gas to distinguish it from coal gas. I mean, it's not like coal gas is the dominant
Oh, but
source of
by
energy.
that point, it
So,
had a name, right? So you just stick with the name. But anyways, natural gas can also, sometimes it's called methane gas, which is a little bit confusing because it's not 100% pure methane gas. Natural gas is about 97% pure methane gas, and that's only after it's been refined a bit to weed out some of the other components. But it does have to be said that natural gas, whether or not its name is unfortunate, was quite an improvement over coal gas, which is indeed so much more toxic than natural gas, in part because it has quite a bit of carbon monoxide in it. And here's another fun fact. Coal gas is what was piped around towns for gas lights, as made famous in the movie Gaslight. Christina breaking in to insert a trigger warning. If any of you are going to be triggered by discussion of a method for killing yourself, then you should probably jump ahead to about minute 11, the beginning of minute 11, and at which point that discussion is over. Coal gas was also used in gas stoves and wasn't really displaced by natural gas in some places until well into the 1960s.
oh crap. So that's why in all those books about people at like the turn of the century, the dramatic suicide of a character sticking their head in the oven is like a thing. I mean, like, it's not just fiction either. The famous poet Sylvia Plath actually chose to go out that way, and she was living around the same time as
Yeah, it
all
was
of
the
these.
1950s, right? Oh, Christina, guess again. She actually killed herself in 1963.
But these days, since we're not using coal gas, I assume you'd be more likely to actually blow up the house than fade swiftly off into oblivion because fossil gas just doesn't really have the same power to asphyxiate you. It's still dangerous, like, don't get me wrong, but I guess it's just more noticeably lethal.
The problem was the carbon monoxide. So this natural gas slash fossil gas is just more likely to take out the neighboring three households too, if you choose it as your way to shuffle off this mortal coil. So don't do that. In the sense that switching from coal gas to natural gas removed this easy avenue for suicide, to the point where it actually caused suicide rates to drop in the years following the switchover, natural gas was a considerable improvement over coal gas, right? So it's harder to kill yourself with because it's less toxic. It's also better for the people who have to produce it.
I can imagine.
Yeah, people used to get really sick producing coal gas, right? And so again, the whole natural part of natural gas is that it comes out of the ground. When you pump oil to the surface, it just naturally fizzes out, since the pressure at the surface is much less than the pressure underground. It's like opening a carbonated beverage, right? Open a beverage, the pressure goes down, the carbonation fizzes out. That gas no longer stays dissolved inside the liquid. So this is also why pumping oil out of the ground is such a potent source of methane to the atmosphere, because it's hard not to let a lot of this natural gas, this methane, this mostly methane gas, leak out during this process.
And like methane is a powerful greenhouse gas, so this is not a good thing.
No, it's not. And exactly how much more powerful than carbon dioxide in terms of warming climate, yeah, it's hard to exactly say because methane has a shorter lifetime in the atmosphere than carbon dioxide, so it's stronger, but it doesn't last as long. So over time windows of a couple of decades to a century, a ton of methane will do somewhere between 28 and 100 times more global warming than a ton of CO2.
So fossil gas is better than coal gas because it's less toxic to humans in the short term, but it's still a nightmare for global warming.
Coal is also a nightmare for global warming. So,
Well, yeah.
um, but also when you burn natural gas in stoves, ovens, and gas-fired power plants, you convert the methane into CO2, which also goes off into the atmosphere, and it's that main greenhouse gas of ours in terms of global warming. So there is incentive there to switch over from natural gas to hydrogen, which just is going to be spitting out water, right? I mean, it
Hmm.
sounds like it would be a big step in the right direction, or two steps actually.
Oh, two steps. How do you mean?
Well, I mean, just because we can use hydrogen as a fuel in two different ways, right? We can burn it and make electricity out of it or whatever, or we can put it into fuel cells and get electricity out of it, right? And so swapping hydrogen in for natural gas kind of does sound like a benign intermediate step in our transition over to fully renewable energy. I mean, look, Ma, no CO2.
Okay, that does sound pretty great as a median step to get us off fossil fuels and towards renewables.
Yeah, okay, but then you get to the fine print.
Oh,
So, for starters, you can't just switch from natural gas to H2, the hydrogen gas. You have to retrofit. You have to buy or build new boilers, stoves, ovens, and gas-fired power plants. And not to mention, you have to replace the entire network of gas lines in cities that deliver natural gas to consumers.
that sounds really inconvenient and expensive. Like, why would you have to do all that retrofitting in the first place?
So there are two reasons. Firstly, hydrogen burns hotter than natural gas and also propane, right? Some people also cook with propane. So if you burn hydrogen with a burner made for natural gas or propane, you're probably going to melt it.
Bummer for the burner.
But there's more, because at the same time, hydrogen is a far less energy-dense gas than natural gas, meaning that you get less energy out of a given volume of hydrogen than you would get from the same volume of natural gas.
So that means in order to release the same amount of energy or heat from hydrogen instead of fossil gas, you have to oxidize a larger volume of gas faster than with fossil gas.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that means you have to deliver a bigger volume of hydrogen faster than we have to right now with natural gas, which means the current natural gas pipeline network going to all these houses and other buildings won't work for hydrogen. You need bigger pipes. So that means you need not just bigger burners, but an entirely new network of bigger pipes. So we can't just switch over from natural gas to hydrogen. And, you also have to ask if you even want all these pipes because, they're going to leak H2 quite easily because it's a very leaky sort of gas. And,
Hmm.
and so you're going to lose hydrogen, that costs money. And hydrogen is still incredibly explosive, far worse than natural gas. So do you really want a network of hydrogen pipes running through your neighborhoods and hydrogen tankers, which are going to have to be big because that gas is less energy dense than natural gas, driving through your city to refill fueling stations?
No.
It
That
wasn't really a trick question, was it?
that does not sound great. But I'm wondering, like, what's going to happen with all those gas pipes in the ground that are currently piping like natural or, I mean, fossil gas into people's houses if we phase out the fossil gas, which we're currently doing. It kind of sounds like we won't be able to use those pipes for hydrogen, but can we use them for like anything else?
Can we use them for anything? No idea. Probably not. If we phase out natural gas, or rather, when we phase out natural gas in the coming decade or two, the networks of pipes delivering natural gas all over town will become basically useless. And the companies that own the pipes will have to write off those billions of dollars in assets because the pipes will most likely just be abandoned. They will become, I think the term here is stranded assets, right? So something that at the moment is worth something, but then suddenly one day you can't squeeze value out of it anymore, even though it's still there.
Hmm.
So the natural gas pipes running through our cities and towns won't even be removed from the ground because that would be even more expensive. And meanwhile, building up a network of pipes suitable for hydrogen is just not going to happen. Everything about it is way too expensive, potentially explosive, and just overall impractical.
That kind of sounds like a non-starter then. Like, unless some billionaire decides that hydrogen is the way of the future and gets really into funding urban planning and development.
I mean, they'd have to be way more than just a simple billionaire. I mean, just to lay hydrogen pipes in a single town would cost billions. It would take way more than a single investor to do something like that. In fact, I doubt even a consortium of investors would do it. Not without significant state support, anyway. And I don't think there is going to be any states willing to invest in something as inconvenient as, and as we'll come to see, energy inefficient as running household cooking and heating off of hydrogen.
Anyway, I'm far more excited about the hydrogen-powered fuel cells. So the other stuff that's not quite so expensive, question mark. So even if it like 99.9% of the rest of humanity, I don't really know how they work, except kind of like magic, I guess. You put hydrogen in and out comes electricity and like water, and that's the only byproduct. I don't know, it sounds nice.
Okay, to put that slightly more technically, a hydrogen fuel cell converts chemical energy released during the oxidation of H2 by O2 into electrical energy. It does this by using catalysts that bind the hydrogen and oxygen together to form water, producing electricity and heat in the process.
I'm not too sure. That sounds a lot less like magic to me.
Would it help if I told you that fuel cells have three adjacent layers: the anode layer, the electrolyte layer, and the cathode layer?
Possibly not. And I don't see how that's related at all, but go for it. Like, I'm ready to learn. Lay it on me.
In a hydrogen fuel cell, the anode layer is where the catalyst breaks the hydrogen-hydrogen bond of H2, liberating hydrogen ions, also known as H+, also known as protons, along with negatively charged electrons, because you have to respect the charge balance.
Oh, of course. I mean, that's something I always do.
Well, it actually is something you always do. You just don't know you do it. Oh, so the electrolyte layer ushers the hydrogen ions toward the cathode, where they react with oxygen and with electrons to form H2O and energy.
Oh, so the waste material just turns into water instead of CO2. That's really exciting.
Yeah, I mean, there's no carbon involved in the reaction, right? So the other exciting thing is that the conversion of hydrogen to electrical energy in a fuel cell is 40 to 60% efficient, which beats the pants off of burning hydrocarbons to run a combustion engine, for instance, which is more like 25 to 35% efficient on a really good day with a really good car.
So then what's not to love about using hydrogen as a fuel? Although we're not, as you say, going to be piping hydrogen everywhere the way we do with fossil gas, fuel cells sound like they could be a good mobile source of energy, like used in things like cars or big trucks, aka lorries for our British audience.
Yeah, I gotta
Uh,
wonder, do you guys up in Canada say trucks or lorries?
we say trucks.
All right.
Very Americanized that way, yes. But as I was saying, it could be used in big things. So like cruise ships and container ships and like maybe even drones. And I mean the kind that you can put cool cameras on for wildlife documentaries, or maybe someday used to deliver pizzas, not the military things that are armed with bombs.
Pizza is way more solar punk than bombs.
Also the wildlife documentaries.
Anyway, the problems come up when you start looking into how we currently produce hydrogen and how we would most likely produce it in the future. Not that hydrogen production is a deal breaker, but there are some practical constraints that will shape how we produce and consume hydrogen in the future, and for what reasons. So at the moment, what is a deal breaker is that 95% of hydrogen is produced by doing this thing called steam reforming of natural gas to extract H2 out of it. That means that even if it isn't directly producing CO2 when we're extracting energy out of it today, H2 is a fossil fuel, which means we're still mining it out of the ground and that there is still this methane leak problem associated with it. And then there is this inconvenient fact that people are burning the natural gas that is creating the CO2.
Yeah, the industry loves to talk about green hydrogen. Like every once in a while, there's news about it being the way of the future. So tell me what's up with that. And why do we call it green hydrogen?
Okay, for some people, it's probably enough that burning it or using it in a fuel cell doesn't release CO2. But what's actually potentially green about hydrogen as a fuel is that the other way you can produce H2 is via the electrolysis of water, which is something your high school biology or chemistry teacher might have demonstrated. And there are tons of videos on YouTube demonstrating it because it's got that sort of same wow factor as a baking soda volcano or a glowing pickle, and it's super easy to do with some pretty basic supplies. It makes people feel like, wow, science.
Okay, I have a confession to make. I definitely do not remember the details of that particular process. So, could you refresh my memory?
So basically, you start with a container of water that you've added ions to in the form of something like salt or baking soda to make the water a better conductor of electricity. Then you run electricity through the water by putting, for instance, the anode and cathode electrodes of a battery into water, or, better yet, use connectors of some sort so that you're not plunking the battery into the water. That's a bad idea. So what you want is the anode and the cathode to be in the water so electricity conducted by the ions in the water can flow between them. When you do this, you'll start splitting water into hydrogen and oxygen. On the anode, you'll be producing O2, and on the cathode, you'll be producing H2. This makes it easy to separate out the two different products of the electrolysis. You just need to position a collection tube over each electrode to collect the O2 from the anode and the H2 from the cathode. Just make sure you're able to collect twice the volume on the cathode side because, H2, there's twice as much hydrogen. There's twice as many hydrogen atoms in water as oxygen atoms.
Oh, I see. So in the future, the devices that will produce hydrogen will just basically be fancier, more energy efficient, scaled up versions of electrodes in a cup of salty water. And let me guess, if they do this electrolysis using electricity produced via solar or wind power, then that's how you could produce hydrogen fuel in a renewable way. So hence this idea of green hydrogen.
Yeah, exactly.
But hang on a second, we'd be using electricity to produce hydrogen that we put into fuel cells to then produce electricity.
Yeah, it is a little bit circular. And the electricity we would get out would probably be less than half of what we put in the first place, because none of these reactions are anywhere like 100% efficient in terms of energy out equaling energy in. I mean, that's just the way the universe works. So this gets even worse if at some point you're also converting the H2 to NH3, also known as ammonia, because that's actually a much better thing to ship or store than H2. So if you want to ship the fuel from its point of production to its point of use, H2 easily catches fire and explodes, but ammonia is so sluggish about that. If you want to use it as a fuel, you have to add hydrogen into the mix. Otherwise, you're just going to have trouble getting it to burn and you get energy out to get energy out of it. So, although maybe someday the techniques to go from electricity to hydrogen and then from hydrogen back to electricity might become marvelously more efficient than they are now. And ditto, for the ammonia step that may or may not be in between, but right at the moment, things are very inefficient.
Wow. Okay. So I mostly followed that. What I did get out of it is that it's a loss of more than half of the energy. So producing hydrogen from water might be green, but it seems kind of stupid.
Yes, it is stupid, but no, not if we produce hydrogen from water strategically. And this finally brings us to exactly what is exciting about hydrogen and to how we will end up using hydrogen in the future. I mean, most likely, if we're sensible. Okay, so maybe we won't do that because we're not very sensible, but anyways.
Okay, so tell me about this like ideal future where we're sensible, because I'm getting pretty disillusioned about like hydrogen as a miracle fuel at this point.
Consider the electricity grid. In order to keep it stable, the supply and demand of electricity need to be carefully balanced. This means that there are facilities whose job it is to bring power plants on and offline as needed. I mean, and, sometimes you have to predict it in advance as well, because they take some time to spin up or to spin down. And so, in order to prevent blackouts and surges. So right now, this mostly means big things, a small number of big things, like coal and gas-fired power plants. But also more and more, it's coming to mean wind turbines and solar panels. Okay, so right now, where I am, it's sunny, warm, and a little bit breezy. And the wind turbines up the hill from me are not spinning. It's the middle of the day, nobody has their lights on, nobody's running their electric stoves, people are at work, not at home charging their electric cars, or at least those few people here who actually have them. Meanwhile, people with solar arrays on their homes are definitely not using any electricity from the grid. So demand is rock bottom right now. So the wind turbines aren't spinning because there isn't enough demand for electricity to have the wind turbines running and adding electricity into the grid. So somebody somewhere sitting in front of the big control panel, maybe a couple 100 miles away, turned them off at some point this afternoon, or maybe even this morning already.
Huh. So, but like, can't the grid just store that energy in batteries or something for later use?
Yeah, okay, in principle, if such enormous banks of batteries existed. Much easier is just to scale back production of electricity at times when demand is low and ramp it up when demand is high. It's how we've always done it. So that being said, that's much easier to do when you have a small number of big power plants, some of which can be taken on and offline relatively easy. And again, that's how we've handled it, by having enough power plants to cover peak electricity demand and keeping a number of them idle during the rest of the time. Okay, in the future, this will be more complicated because the electricity production will be far less centralized than it is now. Most people will have solar arrays on their roof, and there will be more and more wind farms. And not only is that far more decentralized, because of clouds and wind, both of which can be quite variable on the time scale of minutes to hours, this is a power supply that fluctuates a lot more and can be much harder to predict. So in order to keep the grid stable, the grid's going to have to become a smart grid that can decide to stop this neighborhood solar arrays from feeding power into the grid, or that neighborhood solar arrays from feeding into the grid when demand is too low.
Okay, that makes sense, but it also seems really wrong.
It does seem a little bit inefficient. And yeah, there's definitely issues that need to be worked out about how to equitably block the various different people's solar arrays from selling their solar electricity into the grid. Okay, but it's very simply on a physical level, it's going to have to be done if we want to have a reliable electricity grid. Otherwise, the supply will fluctuate too much, and at times it could be overloaded to the point where what's coming down the wires fries equipment and starts fires.
Okay, I mean, like, that's not great, but it does make a bit more sense now to me.
Okay, but that's not the end of the story, because there's a possibility here. And we could take advantage of it. Instead of wasting this electricity that we're not feeding into the grid from solar arrays, or that we're not producing because we turned the wind turbines off when demand was low, we could use it to produce hydrogen fuel from water.
Oh, that's clever. Because then it doesn't matter so much that the conversion of electricity to hydrogen isn't like perfectly efficient, because you'd be just losing or like not gaining this electricity anyways.
Right. So you can sort of use H2 like a battery, kind of, but without all the metals you'd have to mine out of the ground. Okay, not really a battery, but a storage facility for energy.
So storing energy, not just for like cruise ships and container ships, say, but also for those times like when demand is high, but it's like dark outside and cold and the wind isn't blowing.
Right. And in those times then you could turn on a hydrogen capable electricity power plant, for instance. Either with a burner or fuel cells, right? And so, and another fun fact, Germans even have a term for those
I'm
times
not
when
surprised.
the kalte Dunkelflaute. It's two words. And it translates as the cold, dark doldrums. Okay, what's interesting thing, I think if you said the cold, dark doldrums to people in English, they'd be like, huh? But in German, it totally gets the whole point across to people that sometimes it'll be too cold. So everyone will want to have their heat pumps running, so they'll need electricity. And it'll also be dark outside and just not windy at all, and it will be impossible to generate enough renewable energy to cover the demand. And so hydrogen-capable power plants would be a useful thing for, these kalte Dunkelflaute times.
I like that term. The specificity and pronunciation is really fun. I don't think it's ever going to be as big a hit as, say, Schadenfreude.
Yeah, or Zeitgeist.
Speaking of which, you've covered a lot of the science behind how hydrogen might work as a fuel, but now I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the political context for all of this.
All right. I always forget that there's a human behavior aspect to these things. I am such a typical scientist that way.
I think this is where I need to put in some sort of plug for like interdisciplinary collaboration, arts and sciences. We need each other, but like back to my point. So, as of the date of this recording, the Canadian government released 6 days ago a document they called the Hydrogen Strategy for Canada. And this is kind of huge. The Canadian economy is basically just like 6 or 7 monopolies in a trench coat at this point. And the government is pretty intensely wrapped up in fossil fuel production. And yet, to quote that document, approximately 80 low carbon hydrogen production projects have been announced, representing an expression of interest of over $100 billion in potential investment dedicated to building out this clean energy opportunity. So it's being touted as both an economic boon and a way for Canada to make its goal of net zero emissions by 2050. I can't stress how much of a pivot this is. The government owns the Trans Mountain pipeline that transports crude from the Alberta tar sands to the coast of BC to ship it off to other countries. And there's like a state gas company that's literally called PetroCan, and you can see their gas stations all across the country. So for the government to be seriously putting effort and resources towards a different fuel is pretty major.
Even though I am a scientist, often blindsided by this pesky thing known as human behavior, I do actually have thoughts on this. But I will keep my trap shut for the moment and just say, so this didn't come out of nowhere, did it?
Yeah, actually, the news has been talking about this for a while, but it recently, like in the past, like 4 or 5 years, ramped up a lot. And actually, there are two different hydrogens that are buzzwords here. So there's blue hydrogen and there's green hydrogen.
Oh, okay. Blue hydrogen? That one's new for me.
So these colors actually refer to where the energy for hydrogen production comes from. Its creation needs to be fueled by something. We have to consume fuel to make fuel, right?
Yeah, I mean that part's not surprising, but what energy source is blue? I mean, I can't imagine this means there's a marine source here involved.
Well, let me tell you, there's also gray, pink, and yellow hydrogen.
You'll have to excuse me for the moment while I say, oh, for fuck's sake.
Wait. Okay, stay with me here. So green hydrogen refers to hydrogen that is electrolyzed with water, fueled only by renewable sources like wind, solar, and hydropower. Blue hydrogen is the same thing as the hydrogen made through steam reforming fossil gas. When you mentioned that 95% of hydrogen is produced this way, it means that 95% of hydrogen is what we call blue hydrogen.
Hello, it's Christina breaking in here as I edit this episode. Actually, most of the hydrogen is actually gray hydrogen, not blue. So, meaning that it's produced from a fossil fuel, but there is not any carbon capture and storage involved in its production. Well, it is sad, so I guess that is apt that hydrogen is blue.
It's a catchy shorthand that's easier for people to remember.
Yeah, PR washing, I'd call it.
I mean, I think that's also a valid interpretation. But important to note is that blue hydrogen refers to hydrogen made from fossil gas, but the byproduct CO2 is captured by the process of carbon capture, utilization, and storage, or CCUS.
Sorry,
So,
but the U is kind of bogus there because it just ends up back in the atmosphere.
look, okay, I'm just trying to explain.
I hate the U. Sorry.
I'm not in charge of this.
It's like, put it in Coca-Cola and we can say we sequestered it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, theoretically, no greenhouse gases are released into the atmosphere in blue hydrogen, right? I have my own opinions about CCUS, but that is not the point of this episode, and I refuse to go on a tangent right now. So let's just put a pin in that for another time, shall we?
Yeah, Coca-Cola and burps aside, I still call BS because it's unlikely that there are no methane leaks, even if you're doing carbon capture and storage. I'm left out the U there. And it's unlikely that 100% of the natural gas that is being burned in gas-fired power plants, left over after you've sucked the hydrogen out of it, is being burned in power plants fitted with carbon capture and storage devices. But anyway, so what about gray, pink, and yellow hydrogen?
Gray is actually exactly the same as blue, but the carbon produced isn't captured. It's just released directly into the air, which is gross, I know. And pink is hydrogen that is made with electrolysis that is fueled by nuclear power. And yellow is hydrogen made with electrolysis fueled by only solar power.
Yeah, not that anyone ever knows where their electrons come from. But anyways, I stand by my oh for fuck's sake. And I'll go ahead and ask the question I can sort of guess the answer to. What about all this is political exactly?
Yeah, you can probably guess. So hydrogen, as I said, is touted as a way for countries to transition to clean energy by 2050, or whatever their goal is. But there's a lot of controversy over where the hydrogen is coming from, how it's produced, and how it will be used. For example, the Canadian government has a huge incentive to invest in CCUS, the U there notwithstanding, so that we can develop and use blue hydrogen. And there's no real need to transition to any truly green options. So a lot of the political pushback from environmental, scientific, and academic groups in Canada on CCUS is because of this. They argue that investing in it is basically just a license for fossil fuel companies to continue their business as usual devastation of the environment and Indigenous lands. On the flip side, it is policy that seems to support oil sands workers and generally looks very good politically.
This all sounds to me like a horrific way to cover up the fact that the same old companies that brought us global warming, while raking in money hand over fist, are going to keep doing more or less the same old things they've been doing until there are really no more fossil fuels left in the ground. I mean, label the hydrogen you produce from natural gas with a pretty color, and you distract people from the fact that you're still pumping natural gas out of the ground and selling it so it can be burned in power plants or whatever. Because these companies hate to see an asset stranded before they've squeezed all the $1 billion out of it that they could, regardless of what it does to the environment or even to the odds of the continuing survival of large swaths of humanity. I mean, really, it makes me so angry sometimes. And it makes me want to go out and explain all this stuff to everyone. Except that most of us aren't interested in understanding all this stuff, or we feel like we're not smart enough, or honestly, we're just too busy holding our heads above water to take a serious stand against the stream that we have little choice but to swim against.
Ugh, I feel that.
On some level, we want to drive our cars, heat our homes, cook our dinners, take warm showers, and just go about living our lives. And we've been happy to let the oil companies make that so easily possible. And we still haven't really sufficiently grasped the fact that the environmental bill is coming due. And not only are all of us going to have to pay for it, it's going to cost some of us a whole lot more than it's going to cost others of us.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing that makes me sometimes a bit angry is that we could be changing all of this for the better right now. We have the technology. Sorry?
I said it only sometimes makes you angry.
Sometimes I'm busy trying to swim to keep my head above water, right? So,
Oh, right. Yeah. Yeah.
we have the technology and the money to do it. And we will be changing everything over the next 100 years. So, why not start seriously with it right now? Or better yet, decades ago already, before things reach a crisis point, and we have to do everything badly in the panic of climate disaster and social unrest. Okay, but right, I'm almost certainly preaching to the choir right now.
Actually, that reminds me, a funny story about having started decades ago already. But there was a Canadian who retrofitted his old Chevy Impala to run on what he called hydrofuel NH3, which is a mixture of hydrogen and ammonia. This was back in like 1981 already. The guy's name is Greg Vizina, and he was brought to our attention by a listener who wants to remain anonymous. Vizina's not, though. You can check out his YouTube channel to see the car in action. This blend of hydrogen and ammonia apparently works really well. If you go to the website nh3fuel.com, you can see that recently there's actually been a ton of interest in this alternate fuel. There are 7 patents pending with like the University of Toronto, plus a US patent pending. And that's just what I could see from going to the first page of the site. The U of T is working with hydrofuel to produce green hydrogen and ammonia through solar energy as of 2023.
Ah, right. So first you have to make green hydrogen, and then you have to use more renewably generated electricity plus another set of catalysts to react as hydrogen with the nitrogen gas in air in order to create ammonia, those NH3 molecules, right? Okay, the same thing you have to go through if you want to store hydrogen in a non-explosive, not terribly flammable form.
Mhm.
And then if you want to burn this ammonia as a fuel, then you have to put the hydrogen back in, right? This actually, I wouldn't say it isn't rocket science, but it may actually be rocket science. But pardon me for being skeptical, but that sounds like a recipe for making the making of green fuel even more energy inefficient than it already is, since it introduces a second huge step and requirement for materials and facilities into the production process, right? First you have to make the hydrogen from water, and then you need to make the ammonia from the hydrogen. Plus, nitrogen, which you have from air. And splitting nitrogen, that N2 gas, is not a trivial undertaking. I mean, it's already stupid that you probably have to do this anyway if you want to transport hydrogen around unexplosively. But the lesson to take from this is that we should only be transporting it as absolutely necessary, not that we should go hog wild and start making ammonia for all the cars. That's my feeling, anyways. At any rate, since renewable electricity wasn't a big thing in 1981, and people weren't yet stressed about climate change, I mean, I can kind of see why it has taken so long for there to have been much progress on hydrofuel-powered cars, or hydrofuel ammonia-powered cars.
Plenty of people were stressed about climate change back then, but they weren't the people in charge who were able to spin a narrative that it just wasn't all that bad. And so the other people in power just didn't do anything about it. I'm willing to bet that hydrofuel was an invention spurred by the peak oil fears of the 1980s, actually.
Well, I mean, we had just come through a big set of oil crises as well, which, they kind of crippled the economy. And since it takes years to develop techniques that was the 70s, so that's also just the right timeline for 1981.
So for those unfamiliar, peak oil is the theorized point in time when the maximum rate of global oil production will occur, after which there will be an irreversible decline because oil is not renewable in any way. So there
Well,
was
depends on how patient you are.
well,
If you can wait millions of years.
not renewable in any way, Christina. So there was an energy crisis in like the early 1970s. And to give you a bit of a picture, is the reason we have the term stagflation. So oil prices skyrocketed at the same time as the supply became scarce. It was a huge wake-up call. And so even though the crisis was averted, the Canadian government actually started investing in alternative fuel research later that decade. And then in the early 80s or mid 80s, they decided it really wasn't a priority anymore. Basically, there is political will to find alternative energy sources for a few years, and then there suddenly wasn't. Funding dried up pretty abruptly, as did public interest, because suddenly new oil reserves were discovered, and we didn't have to stop being so terrible to the planet after all. We could just continue business as usual.
Yeah, oil companies also killed development and adoption of solar panels. They had and have petroleum assets on their hands, not yet fully plundered reservoirs and new reservoirs to tap, and they want to milk more billions of dollars out of it. I mean, that's their business.
Yeah, I mean, it goes to show that even if scientists and engineers invent the best possible technology to give us clean, green fuel that's renewable and sustainable forever, it doesn't mean a thing if there isn't any political attention, or as is increasingly the case these days, money backing it. Like good PR helps too, of course. If people's first thought when you mention hydrogen fuel is the Hindenburg disaster, they're probably not going to agree with you that it's a great idea, for example.
Color me skeptical that we're all going to be driving cars with hydrofuel ammonia, again, which has hydrogen mixed into it to make it burn better than just pure ammonia. Also, right now the planet is choking on all the ammonia we have manufactured via the enormously energy-intensive Haber-Bosch process, which creates ammonia mostly for fertilizer, but also for weapons. Right? We've literally doubled the amount of biologically usable nitrogen entering the biosphere every year through this process, to the point where 80% of the nitrogen found in our bodies, right, like in proteins and stuff like that, comes not from biological nitrogen fixation, which is what like beans and other legumes do, but via the Haber-Bosch process.
The Haber-Bosch process, that sounds kind of like a hat to me.
No,
Like
I think that's a Hamburg.
I was thinking haberdashery,
Ah,
but
okay.
linguistics stuff. Anyway, tell me about it.
Since its invention in the first years of the 20th century, the Haber-Bosch process has been the main industrial method for creating ammonia, like I said, for fertilizer and weapons. It happens in huge factories with miles of gleaming steel tubing, with catalysts at high pressure and temperature. First they produce H2 from methane from natural gas via steam reforming, then they react the H2 with the N2 from the air to form ammonia, that NH3. And right now, this produces at least 230 million tons of ammonia per year, and in so doing, uses up about 5% of the world's supply of natural gas. So, this is not a trivial bit of ammonia production we're talking about that's going on already without driving any cars with this stuff.
Hmm.
So, I mean, like literally, half of the human race, half of the people alive today would not be here without this artificial production of ammonia fertilizer. Not to mention, neither would literally tens of billions of cows, pigs, and chickens, etc. That's how much biologically utilizable nitrogen we've added to the Earth system. Meanwhile, all this nitrogen that we spray on fields as fertilizer to grow food for ourselves and our cows, etc., tends to end up via sewage or runoff in waterways, where it has been wreaking havoc with aquatic ecosystems. Algae released from the nitrogen limitation that would normally slow down or stop their growth are now clogging up streams, rivers, and lakes, changing the ecological structure of populations. They can produce so much biomass. When they get old and die and decay, this decay uses up all the oxygen in the water, creating dead zones, where animals, like fish who swim into them, literally suffocate in great masses. From the point of view of someone who's done a lot of work on aquatic biogeochemistry, the last thing in the world, the last thing the world needs is a bunch of people making yet more ammonia, a biologically usable source of nitrogen.
Hmm.
But my rant is not over, because there is also the issue of incomplete combustion. If you're, burning this ammonia, hydrofuel ammonia in a car, you wouldn't burn it completely. You would not just be spitting water out the tailpipe, water and nitrogen gas, of billions of automobiles running on hydrofuel ammonia, but also nitrous oxide, which is a potent greenhouse gas. And it's also extremely bad because it can deplete the ozone layer. It's very damaging to ozone gas.
Okay, that is a big yikes, and I knew none of that.
Well, they conveniently don't mention this stuff,
Hmm.
right? These guys who are excited about it, they don't tell you what the downsides are. They just give you their genius vision.
Well, also, I mean, if you weren't explaining it to me, like if it was a paragraph in a textbook, I definitely would just glaze over and
Right, they don't
not
even put this
absorb
stuff
it.
in textbooks, right? I mean, right. So, sorry, but this hydrofuel ammonia idea gets really two big thumbs down from me.
Mm.
right? So what if people still want to gun their Camaros or whatever? I mean, do they even still make Camaros? Anyways, doesn't matter. Hydrofuel ammonia can only be less energy efficient than running off of green hydrogen in fuel cells and way, way less efficient than running off of renewable electricity directly. And replacing all the gasoline and diesel that we're currently using with hydrofuel ammonia or ammonia hydrofuel. Sorry, I always get those two confused. Would horrifically mess with an already horrifically messed up biogeochemical cycle that is already wreaking massive ecological havoc. And it would still produce greenhouse gas emissions because CO2 is not the only greenhouse gas. And yeah, then there's the ozone depletion issue. I mean, honestly, I even want to take my shoes off and add my two big toes to the two big thumbs down.
Wow. Knowing the science behind ammonia production gives me a lot more nuanced perspective on this whole business. I mean, tangentially, I also wonder how much drivers will be charged to fuel up with hydrogen or a mixture of hydrogen and ammonia. Like, is it even going to be financially feasible at the user endpoint?
So these people who are totally into it say it's going to be cheaper than gasoline or diesel, 25 cents a gallon, blah, 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 whatever. I don't know. I don't know. But I just, if you're making it from electricity you've generated renewably, it simply can't be cheaper than the price of that electricity itself. That's,
Huh.
unless I don't understand how the world works.
Well, I know I was just gonna say, like the production process sounds really intense. Like, I mean, intense enough to like cost a lot to do.
Well,
So,
I'm sure they would try to replace the Haber-Bosch process with something else, but I mean, at the moment, it's all Haber-Bosch, pretty much. But let's just talk here a second about the price of wind and solar electricity. The costs for producing renewable electricity this way are dropping drastically, and they're already cheaper than, say, electricity produced in nuclear power plants, and also cheaper than electricity produced in coal-fired power plants. And at least at peak times, anyways, natural gas-fired power plant electricity as well.
Mhm.
And, so, I mean, honestly, why can't we let go of internal combustion engines? Right? They served us for, I don't know what, like 150 years or now? But now it's time to move on to something quieter and with fewer moving parts, something that is more energy efficient and less likely to choke up the biosphere with an excess of nutrients that tend to get used by noxious species like phytoplankton, who suddenly have so much nitrogen relative to how fast they can photosynthesize, they can channel that into making toxic compounds, such as those that cause paralytic shellfish poisoning or amnesic shellfish poisoning and red tides. In terms of this hydrofuel ammonia or ammonia hydrofuel, we don't need an alternative that lets us do more of the same stuff that we're doing because we suddenly think that we're being so green now, right? We need to change the way we fuel things and the way we do things.
I totally agree. You are right. Like fueling cars with renewable energy, regardless of the source, isn't going to change the fact that our towns and cities, hell, entire countries, are not built for people. They're built for automobiles. In Canada alone, 1,745 people were killed in car accidents in 2020, and 7,868 people were seriously injured.
Oh, right. And that was the year when we were all sitting at home trying not to die.
Yeah, exactly. That was, like I was reading this statistics report and they were like, yeah, this is down like like however many percent from the year before. And I was like, well, obviously, this isn't a win, you guys.
Well,
This is
it was complicated because fewer people were driving, but the people who were driving faster and blowing through red lights. So the
okay, we can
number of
talk about that.
I think the number of fatalities per miles driven went up, but the total number of fatalities went down. But anyways, carry on.
Anyways, yes. What was I saying? Oh, right. Yeah. If you're run over by a truck running on renewable energy, you're still going to end up in the hospital, the same as if you were run over by a truck that was running on fossil gas. Like, I don't know, maybe I'm biased because I was seriously injured in a car accident, but I don't really want to have to take a huge risk every time I want to go somewhere. Like, give me public transport, please. Like, I'm not saying get rid of all vehicles. Like, I'm well aware that plenty of jobs require specialized vehicles or hell, even just pickup trucks for hauling around gear. And that driving a vehicle is amazing when you have mobility issues or simply are doing a large grocery haul of like bulky items. And also like road trips and camping are a thing. But I think that if we had reliable, affordable transit that had comprehensive service, it just wouldn't be necessary for most people to have to drive around to noisy death machines that are costly to move, costly to service, costly to repair, costly to insure. Like, what else am I missing here?
So I just read an interesting article on the BBC website about redesigning roads, streets, and intersections to reduce traffic deaths. I mean, it was really interesting about how municipalities have recognized, or some have, that to save lives, they need to take responsibility for dangerous designs with the intention to reduce traffic deaths to literally 0 per year, I mean, in hopes of getting as close to that target as possible. And so apparently it's a thing in Sweden, and it's sort of spreading even to such car-centric places as the US. So replacing every time you have an accident, trying to figure out how much road design factored into how dangerous that accident was, how many deaths were. Right. Okay,
Yeah.
but that's also another issue for maybe another time. But yes, a utopian public transportation system would be fabulous. Running directly on renewable electricity or on fuel cells filled with hydrogen, and starting from exactly the point of production of hydrogen from water during times of excess renewable electricity production, right? So exactly there, so you don't have to drive it around. I mean, except when you're driving it around, but because it's in your fuel cell.
I just think that, like, even with all this science behind fuel production, we need to remember that we're producing fuel for humans to use. We're producing transportation for humans to use. We're producing cities for humans to use. There's always the human
Oh no,
user,
but we're producing
right?
fuel so that oil companies and their investors can make
Well,
money.
that's what we're doing now. What it should be is that we should always be thinking about the human user who doesn't own the oil companies, who's going to have to pay for this electricity, who's going to have to walk on these streets, who's going to have to like travel to different places in the country. It's just, I don't know. I feel like we have our priorities wrong in this society, and yeah, it makes me mad. Sorry,
Oh,
I'm
you are
mentioning.
such a rabble rouser sometimes.
All this to say, I'm really glad that we had this discussion because I have learned a lot about what goes into producing hydrogen and its viability as a fuel. And I want to thank our listener for bringing it to our attention. There's a lot of potential for green hydrogen in the near future, so long as we're careful about its implementation and use. Like, I think it would be a great idea to have our shipping run on green hydrogen and for it to power large industrial vehicles that we need to fuel somehow. Maybe not a hydrogen stove in every house, though.
Yeah, and definitely not a hydrogen combustion engine in every car.
I mean, so when the issue of hydrogen fuel comes up in the news or on the ballot, as it most certainly will, it's a good idea to look into its proposed production and use. Not all hydrogen is made equally, it turns out.
Yeah, right now most of it's made from a fossil fuel, and apparently some of it's pink.
Yes, some of it is pink. Keep that in mind as you go about your day-to-day, listeners.
Yeah, I mean, I know I won't be able to get it off my mind. I mean, not that hydrogen is really pink, but that marketing is insidious. Not to sound like a conspiracy theorist, it's like a worm that eats your brain, distracting you so you don't know the truth of things.
And yet it works.
Yeah, all too well. Which is why as solarpunks, we should do our research and tell our stories instead of just drinking the blue, gray, green, pink, and yellow Kool-Aid.
Yeah, do not drink the yellow Kool-Aid.
I mean, jeepers, I've already forgotten which type of hydrogen production is yellow. But wait. Don't tell me because it's ridiculous and I don't want to know. I really don't want that bit of bright, shiny, distracting marketing lodging in my brain. So
Mhm.
anyway, all you listeners out there, stay sharp. Don't fall for this stuff. And
Stay solar punk.